Well, good evening, everybody from London, and welcome on behalf of Lawrence and myself to another Harif lecture. I'm sure you're very familiar with us by now. A lot of you are regulars, but for those who are not, Harif is the UK Association of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. And our mission is really to educate and raise awareness of our history and culture, the history and culture of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, of course. We have a website, www.harif.org. Please do subscribe to our mailing list if you're not already there. We have a news blog called Point of No Return that keeps you up to date with the latest developments. This is being recorded. There will be a video uploaded to the Harif website within a couple of days, and it'll be on our YouTube channel. And we're also live streaming to Facebook. So hello, everybody who's watching on Facebook. If anyone has any questions for our speaker tonight, or any comments, please do pop them in the chat at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, we at Harif have been exploring parts of the Jewish world that other organizations don't or can't reach. We've had lectures on Burma, we've had lectures on Baghdadi Jews in China, we've had lectures on India, we've had lectures on Indonesia, most recently a couple of months ago. But tonight we are focusing on the Jews of Borneo. Yes, Borneo, yes. I know what you're thinking. I didn't know there were Jews in Borneo. I didn't either until about a week ago. So North Borneo was a British protectorate in the northern part of the island of Borneo. It is present-day Malaysian Borneo. That is to say the Malaysian state of Sabah. Baghdadi, Sephardi, and Ashkenazi Jews were integral to the development of North Borneo as pioneers, planters, merchants, political refugees, and prisoners of war. We are absolutely delighted to welcome tonight our speaker, Lala Corpus, and thank you to Sam Warshaw and to Lawrence Joffe for introducing Lala to us. It's a last-minute addition to our program, but a very welcome one. Lala comes from North Borneo and has been researching the hidden and diverse history of the area. She is a researcher, a freelance consultant, writer, and editor with a background in applied anthropology and a particular interest in local history. And she will be talking to us for about an hour, and then there will be an opportunity to ask questions. So over to you, Lala. We're looking forward to your talk.
Okay. Thank you, Lynn and Lawrence, for hosting this talk, for giving me an opportunity to tell a story. I just love stories, so hence we have a very big story. And this story actually started with a little conversation with an aunt who mentioned that she stopped getting postcards from Singapore from her friend Yahya Cohen, as she said. I thought it was quite incongruous to hear a name like Yahya Cohen associated with our family, because I do come from a backwater place in Borneo. So that's how it started, and basically it turned into an epic, as far as I'm concerned, and it's incredibly diverse. So we have a lot of ground to cover, and shall I share my screen now?
Yes.
Okay.
Please do.
Oh. Right.
Perfect. Yeah. Lovely map of Borneo.
Yeah, I've got to provide some hinterland to the talk because Borneo always seems to be a myth. It's a mythical place, but it's not. I can attest that I do come from Borneo. Let me see. Let me start my stuff. Okay. Right. Okay. So this is the map of Southeast Asia, and I think many of you are actually familiar with Singapore, because Singapore is so well known. And as you know, the island of Borneo is here, tucked in between Indonesia, Philippines, Indochina, Malaya, and Singapore. And the area that we are interested in is the northern part of Borneo. I'm sure you've heard of Brunei and Kuching. So these names that I've come up with are actually quite important because I'll be mentioning them again. But the most important reference is actually Sandakan. So that's where it all started. I have to provide some historical hinterland to a very brief history of North Borneo. Okay. In December 1877 and January 1878, secession treaties for North Borneo were signed between Baron Gustav von Overbeck, Austrian consul in Hong Kong, and the Sultans of Brunei and Sulu. As you can tell, this is Brunei and this is Sulu. At one stage, they actually controlled part of North Borneo, and hence the secession treaties. The expeditions were financed by Alfred Dent of Dent and Brothers and Company. So it all started. So after the signing of the treaties in February 1878, William Pryor of London, a bookkeeper at Shanghai, landed in Germantown, a settlement on Timbang Island deep in Sandakan Bay. I think I would have a better map here. So as you can tell, this is Sandakan and Timbang Island is there. So this is modern Sandakan. This is quite an important piece of history, really. So he landed in Sandakan as the first white resident on the east coast of North Borneo. Ada Pryor described the landing. My husband was duly installed as the governor of the northeast coast. His entire staff for the inauguration of law and order along a coastline of 300 miles, infested by pirates and marauders of the worst type, being a West Indian named Anderson, a Hindu named Abdul, and a couple of China boys. For provisions, they had a barrel of flour, 17 chickens, and artillery consisted of half a dozen Schneider rifles. And that's what they landed with on the northeast coast of Borneo. So in his first year of office, William Pryor is basically a little bit on him. He's an explorer. So he was used by the British to explore certain parts of the Philippines. But in the first year, when he landed in Sandakan, which is there, he actually had to quell a raid of headhunters and a threat from a Spanish takeover from nearby Philippines. So as you know, Philippines was controlled by the Spanish. So everybody was in a way vying to get the last bastion of the free man, which is North Borneo. Obviously, we have the Dutch in Kalimantan, the French in Indonesia, the British in Singapore, the Spanish in the Philippines, and so on. So in June 1879, Germantown was razed down by an accidental fire, and Pryor took the opportunity to move the settlement to the mainland at the mouth of Sandakan Bay. His statesman and knowledge of the local language earned him respect of the local traders and leaders in the interior and gave him the confidence to relocate Sandakan to the mouth of the bay. So that's modern Sandakan for you. Now we come to the British North Borneo Chartered Company. In 1881, Overbeck transferred his rights to Dent after failing to gain support for his venture from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. To this end, Dent established the North Borneo Provisional Association before being granted a royal charter, which was signed on the 1st of November. Leading the board of directors as the first chairman with its head office in London. We were not colonized from the beginning, although it seemed like colonization. We were just ruled by a royal charter. But ultimately, the company's main premise is to exploit and profit from the natural resources of the state through expedited development process, through private investment and diverse mass migration, including mass labor from Hong Kong, Javanese and Bugis from the Netherlands, Indies, and as well as lots of individuals, intrepid investors, adventurous Europeans, Japanese planters, and so on. On the side note, progress in North Borneo is inextricably and organically linked to the founding of Singapore and Hong Kong. As you know, they are Britain's earliest colonial outpost in Southeast Asia. The very existence of Singapore as a major trading and communication post has significant implications for the history of North Borneo, serving as the main communication hub between the British North Borneo Company in Britain and North Borneo, as well as an administration center for numerous companies that operated there. Inward investment, maritime trade, and migration into North Borneo was also facilitated through Singapore after the founding of Sandakan. Sorry, there was a bit of a... Hong Kong became the mass migration hub for Chinese labor to North Borneo to expedite its development. Similar to Singapore, Hong Kong became a source of inward investment and maritime trade. So in the early heady days of British North Borneo, agricultural pursuits such as sugar, cotton, and tobacco went underway. The clearing of land for agriculture also kickstarted the export of tropical hardwoods such as Belian and Kerowing. The fertile soils attracted Dutch planters from Delhi in Sumatra, Netherlands, India, when they started a huge-scale tobacco planting experiment in 1883. So in the last decade of the 19th century, tobacco became the dominant cash crop, with several companies operating large plantations. So this is the state of Borneo after the company took over. So these towns that I've labeled are actually quite important. So I don't expect you to remember every one of them, but names of these towns will come up sporadically throughout the presentation. So Kudat, which is the north. Kudat became the capital of North Borneo under the administration of the Provisional Association in 1881 under first Governor Treacher. With William Pryor as consul, Sandakan was declared North Borneo's new administrative capital in 1884. Sheltered from perennial typhoons that plagued the Philippine Islands and the South China Sea, Sandakan's deep natural harbor, ample freshwater supply, abundant marine and natural resources, and navigable river access to the interior gave her the advantage over Kudat. So from Sandakan's inception in 1878, there came a steady stream from the world over of company personnel, explorers, planters, entrepreneurs, merchants, attracted by the heady prospect of profit and adventure. So this was Sandakan in actually 1883. This photograph was taken in 1920. So this was how we started. And this was when the first Jews landed in Sandakan in 1882. On a side note, in 1885, Sandakan included 29 Europeans, 1,005 Chinese, 524 Malays, about 800 Suluks, 60 Sikhs, and 24 Indians, 9 Somalis, 27 Dayaks, and 27 Bengalis. So we started off being quite diverse to start with. Now it brings me to introduce the first Jew that landed in Borneo. Unfortunately, I don't have his photograph, but he was probably Baron Benjamin Kisa Cohen de Lissa, and I would consider him North Borneo's first Jewish celebrity. He was born in London in 1842, one of 7 siblings, and the grandson of Aaron Aarons, born in Lissa, Silesia. So I guess De Lissa is an affectation of his name, sort of gave him a bit of an aristocratic feel. He traveled to Australia via Mauritius in the 1850s, where he held a number of jobs and embarked on several loss-making ventures. I think it was this drawback that prompted him to seek his fortunes in North Borneo in August 1882. With sugar dreams in a pipeline, he applied for and was granted a total of 30,000 acres in Sandakan. As well as one of the proponents of North Borneo, Benjamin Cohen de Lissa was one of the nation's ardent supporters. He could well be one of the pioneering exporters of tropical Bornean hardwoods, as in February 1885, his first shipment of logs set sail for Melbourne. He made Sandakan his home for a decade. But what struck me with Benjamin Cohen was his larger-than-life recklessness that earned him quite a reputation, as reported by Governor Treacher in correspondence to the Court of Directors in London. Kicking the Treasurer General in the posterior is decidedly not a gentlemanly action. A loud, towering presence at numerous social functions, his capacity for largesse, lavish hospitality, and his tales of daring do affectionately earned him the well-deserved moniker, Chief Citizen. Mr. Pryor, the founder of Sandakan, affectionately recounted in his column in the Herald, the North Borneo Herald, about Cohen's inspection of a disgruntled caged tiger that he purchased in Singapore and lost a large sample of tailoring from the seat of his trousers and coattails to the black panther in the opposite cage. So pioneer, exporter, importer, planter, logger, entertainer, and tiger tamer. Cohen settled back in Australia with his family in 1892, and he finally sailed away into the sunset in 1898, and he was buried at the Jewish cemetery at Rockwood, Sydney. The next pioneer that's worth a mention is Edward Ellis Abrahamson. He was, in comparison to Cohen, he was a good boy. So born in 1859 in Zwolle in the Netherlands, son of Lion Abraham and Mariana Abrahamson. He arrived in North Borneo in 1883. And he was another planter. He was, I think, one of our first planters. So he planted coffee and cocoa in Sandakan in 84. Interestingly, he established the timber merchants, E. Abrahamson and Company from log ponds in Kopon Island in Sandakan Bay, and where he exported Borneo cedar and other hardwoods to Australia, Hong Kong, and Shanghai. So back to Sandakan, Abrahamson's office was actually along a very posh address. Now, this was a very posh address at the time. It was called the Prior, and I think his office was actually in one of those huts. Okay, so he decided to form the timber business into a company and form the China Borneo Company in Hong Kong, headquartered at his old address in prime Sandakan. The CBC were timber and general merchants, insurance agents, planters. They also owned sawmills and large estates in the interior. The China Borneo Company had a new board of directors headed by an E.A. Solomon. And actually, interestingly, one of the main shareholders of CBC were actually the Sassoon family. As you know, they were based in Shanghai and Hong Kong at the time. He was known for his fairness, and he was affectionately referred to by his workers as Tuan Brasim or Sir Brasim. As you know, they probably couldn't pronounce Abrahamson, so he became a Brasim. Unfortunately, he was dismissed from China Borneo Company in 1891 for its poor performance and returned to London. But he returned back to Borneo and he established a rubber and kutch business in Brunei. As you know, the name appeared earlier. And he died in Bournemouth in 1915. So the next group were the tobacco planters. In the 1880s, the success of the tobacco experiment in North Borneo brought about a heady rush of Dutch planters from Netherlands, Indies, as well as investors from Europe. Borneo became known as the producers of the world's largest, the finest rolling tobacco, as my grandfather would attest, as he had a little tobacco plantation, and he would roll his own cigars, by the way. By 1899, numerous individuals and tobacco plantations companies such as the Rotterdam Borneo Company, the German Tobacco Company, and the Darvel Bay Tobacco Plantation have established themselves in North Borneo. One of the most successful was Darvel Bay Tobacco Plantation, was registered in London in 1989. As you can tell, this is the head office for the new Darvel Bay tobacco plantations. It was run by 3 generations of European Jews until 1930. It was started by Baron Adolf de Stein, followed by Sigmund Sinauer de Stein and Edward Adolf de Stein. The estates were set up through the Baron Adolf's representative in North Borneo, J.F. Warwick and Jose Heyman. I believe Jose Heyman could be a Sephardi Jew. So back to the Steins. Baron Adolf was born in Hesse, Germany in 1931, and he married Selina Nerich in Birmingham, and he was ennobled in 1895. His daughter married Sigmund Sinauer, who took on the name De Stein in 1886. So Sigmund Sinauer was actually his, his son-in-law. Sigmund was born in Lower Saxony, Germany in 1845, and their son, Edward, was born in 1887 in London. Edward was educated in Eton and Oxford and was a merchant banker and served in the First World War. He was first of the De Steins to visit Borneo in 1912, a year after he was made chairman. Interestingly, this little bit is, I need to research it a little bit more, because I did find out there was a Jewish congregation in Sanakan in 1902, and I believe that they were made up of Dutch Jews from Indonesia, because at that point we had many German and Dutch planters. So there are the planters. So a little bit more hinterland. As you know, in an earlier map, I mentioned a town called Jesselton, which is on the west coast. Similar to Sanakan, Jesselton started as a settlement on an offshore island called Gaia. The population of Gaia in 1883 consisted of 80 Chinese and 370 natives, or the Bajaus. Similar to Sanakan, it was basically sacked and burned down by Muhammad Saleh, also known as Mat Saleh. He was a local chieftain from the northeast of Sabah. Mat Saleh, incidentally, here's his picture here. He's a rebel. He's half Suluk, half Bajau. Mat Saleh is also the moniker given to Europeans by the locals. So basically, enraged by the confines of British rule, this disgruntled rebel and his followers staged a rebellion that lasted a decade. And he sacked Gaia, but it was a mere hiccup that had long-term implications. So what happened is, this is the original Gaia township. And what happened was, after being sacked, the government were actually looking for an alternative site. And they decided to move the Gaia township to the mainland, opposite Gaia Bay. And directly opposite Gaia Island. So the new site was named Jesselton after Sir Charles James Jessel, the erstwhile vice chairman of the British North Borneo Company. Sir Jessel never visited North Borneo during his tenure, but his presence in North Borneo history was immortalized in name, as we have Jesselton Coffee Shop, Jesselton Hotel, Jesselton Residences, Jesselton Medical Center, even a Jesselton Dental Center in Singapore. The first Jessel that finally set foot in North Borneo is Sir Jessel's great-grandson, George Jessel, in 2011. And he has since published a book called Finding Jesselton in 2018. Jesselton was renamed Kota Kinabalu in 1967, 4 years after our independence. And here we have basically the village of Jesselton. And this is the very famous railway line that we have on the west coast. And in the background, we have Gaia Island. So next in line, we have a more Sephardi element when we come to the purveyors and the merchants. Just a little bit of hinterland again. Singapore became an important hub for inward investment, migration, and trade for North Borneo. It also provided a safe haven for the settlement of Jews. Jews from Baghdad were known to be the earliest Jewish settlers in Singapore, fleeing persecution from the Ottomans. In the footsteps of the tycoon Manasseh Meyer, who built Singapore's largest synagogue, Magain Aboth, many settled in Singapore. There were only 9 Jews in 1880, and by 1942, there were 1,500 Jews living there. The children attended local schools and assimilated into society. But it's worth to note that I found that Harry Ellis, a prominent Jewish lawyer, whose forebears were from Baghdad, mentioned in 2015 that he attended an Anglican school close to the Jewish quarter, where 7 out of 30 of his classmates were Jewish. And he mentioned that although they were lovingly teased by their classmates, they never queried my Jewishness. It was as if being Jewish was part and parcel of their lives as well. He was invited for meals at his classmate homes, and his parents took care not to serve anything that touched pork, shellfish, or crustaceans. Currently, there's a strong community of 2,500 Jews in Singapore. Only 180 are descendants of the early settlers. Most of them Orthodox Jews, the rest of them expats. So the merchants and agents and importers in North Borneo, a combination of both Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jews from Singapore, such as the Katz brothers, the earlier ones, represented by Mullenbein and Loeb in Sandakan. And we have an S.M. Cohen and Company, and M. Haim, who I believe with a name like that, he would have been Sephardi. And of course, interestingly, this is a bit of a new information. I found out that the Sassoons were merchants in Kudat. Most of them actually imported, look at alcohol, you see, beer and champagne and so on and so forth. And of course, we have E. Benjamin and Cohen. He was represented by I.J. Manasseh and Jesselton. But the two families that I'm going to basically concentrate on is the Cohens and the Messiahs. And they were personal friends of the family. One family that made a huge impact on Sandakan commerce and social scene were Sephardi Jews Menachem Cohen and Moselle Ney Ezra of Yemen and Mesopotamia, respectively. They were first mentioned in North Borneo Herald in 1917, but probably set up themselves in Sandakan a few years later. They opened a haberdashery shop where my mother and sisters used to frequent. Well-loved and unmissable in warmth, character, and girth, Mrs. Cohen became ubiquitous in endless social events, as documented in the Herald and the family photos, such as this one. Parties, weddings, dancing competition, fundraising events. She was there. I mean, she was everywhere. She became a steadfast friend of my grandfather, Pong Holo, and she was well loved by the family. And this is quite an interesting, very sweet anecdote. My auntie Flora mentioned about the time when her papa and Moselle Cohen won a dancing competition, only because the lucky pairing was such a novelty. She said, in her words, a little black man and a big white woman. And here they are, the offending couple. I almost turned this circle into a heart, but never mind, I didn't. So this is a family wedding of my cousin Maggie Newbronner and Alex Funk. So we have here my auntie Flora, very famous auntie Flora that came out. And this is a wonderful pre-war photo of them having a lovely time. And that's my mom looking very much like I look very much like my mom. And this is auntie Flora. And this is the very famous Yahya Cohen that I will sort of speak on a bit more. Apart from that, Agnes Keith, the writer. Now, Agnes Keith was an American writer who lived in Borneo for some time. And she described Mrs. Cohen as a beautiful description of Mrs. Cohen. And she said, she was gorgeous in being and soul, with an oriental splendor of face, hair, and hands. Her hands were melting, her features fine, her expression dramatic, her tears quick and emotions real. She loved bright colors, especially varying shades of hibiscus. Her heart, like her body, was large, soft, and lovable. No one could ask for anything and was refused. They all came for help. Eurasians, Chinese, Malays, housekeepers, kept women. We had quite a few of those in those days over there. Nurses and coolies. She was a force in Sandakan Asiatic life. She was the core of Eurasian society, business, and commerce. No wedding, funeral, or birth was complete without her. Moselle Cohen most deservedly earned the moniker Chief Citizen Cohen II. And I've come to love her through my research as well. The Cohens had 3 children, Yahya, the eldest, in the picture here, Betty and Sima, who were educated in Singapore. Yahya lived in Sandakan until the age 3, and he was sent to Singapore for further education in 1921. I have a suspicion he could have been born in Sandakan in the early years. The next family that's worth a mention were also very steadfast family friends. Little is known about them. I tried to research, but then I've got so many images of this family, and I learned through my auntie Angeline, which is pictured here, about her friends. the Messiah sisters. Israel Messiah, Mosel Cohen's uncle, also ran a haberdashery shop in Sandakan. They were said to be trading rivals until 1935 when the family returned to Singapore. Right. However, the children, Sophie, Rama, Sarah, and David, were firm friends of my aunts. The girls attended Catholic school together with my mom and aunts. And you could see her. That's my mom over there. It's my Auntie Flora here, the little girl. That's Auntie Angeline, and that's Sophie Messiah, and that's Rama Messiah. And these are the girls after they returned to Singapore. And I think this could be Sophie's son. I'm not quite sure. Rama and Sophie were members of the Girl Guides, and Rama appeared in many a school production, including a male role in a Japanese operetta. But sadly, I do have photographs, but I thought I better get on with this presentation. Israel Messiah, the patriarch, passed away in 1941, and I think after that, the family disbanded overseas to Australia and the US. So that was 1930s, Borneo, very harmonious. I would love to be alive then, but not after what's going to happen. That link that I'm sure you all know about the events in Europe that would lead to the Shoah. Little did we know that the foreboding events of Europe in the 1930s would overshadow life in North Borneo. Life was idyllic in Sandakan, diverse and harmonious. The rise of Hitler created a chain of events that would lead a trickle of Jews to North Borneo. And as you can see, it's the Nuremberg race laws, the annexation of Austria by Germany, the Evian Conference that I think spurred on quite a lot of movement there. The Munich Agreement, and of course, Kristallnacht, the Night of the Broken Glass. On a side note, this is a little bit sad, but Sir Neil Malcolm, the last president of the British North Borneo Company from 1926 to 1946, also held a double role as High Commissioner for German Refugees for the League of Nations from February 1936 to 1938. And he was a speaker at the Evian Conference, but his role was seen as unimpressive. But even with his links, Sir Malcolm's involvement in the repatriation of political refugees to North Borneo has been negligible. So as you all know, the chain of events in Europe led to the exodus of political refugees to the Far East. The intensification of Nazi persecution and tighter restrictions in November, especially after Kristallnacht in 1938, saw the exponential increase of Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria bound for Shanghai that required no entry visa. This route was initially facilitated by Lloyd Restino's fleet of 4 ships that include the Conteverde, Rosso, Biancomano, and the Victoria. And they would embark from Trieste or Genova en route to Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Yokohama. Ultimately, 17,000 Jews came to Shanghai on board the Lloyd Restino ships. The route from Trieste was finally suspended indefinitely when Italy joined the war in June 1940. So political refugees bound for North Borneo would have most likely embarked at Singapore on board one of its many liners. At Singapore, they would embark on steamers such as the Marudu, the Darvel, and the Kajang bound for Sandakan. Some Jews actually decided to remain in Singapore and Malaya after finding employment there. Now, the first to arrive was a Dr. Fritz Laban and Mrs. Laban. Now, Dr. Fritz was born in 1890 in Upper Silesia, and he graduated as a doctor of medical dentistry at the University of Berlin. In an attempt to move to Britain, Laban applied and was rejected by Britain's General Medical Council in 1936 and 1937. In February 1938, the British North Borneo Herald announced Dr. Laban's imminent arrival and his appointment by the company, of his appointment by the company to establish a resident practice. As you know, he was basically our second dentist. I don't know what the other dentists were like, but he was to replace a dentist that left us years before. So from June to August 1938, he was seen to be working in General Chesterton Civil Hospital, and he was posted at different locations around North Borneo. Although I cannot establish the connection, one could only assume that his decision to repatriate to North Borneo was based on the second rejection by the GMC, spurred on by the Nuremberg laws in 1935. The second story is a bit of a romantic one. Kitte Arndt, originally from Wilmersdorf, Berlin, and her fiancé, Wilhelm Link, arrived in Sandakan in November 1938, 16 days after Kristallnacht, on the Kajang from Singapore. As you all know, in the 1935 Nuremberg laws, they were forbidden to marry, and they basically eloped to North Borneo. They had a civil wedding in Sandakan, so they married in Sandakan and settled in Singapore Road. They were actually neighbors to my grandfather, Pongholo. And Dr. Link actually took up employment with Liverpudlian Dr. Valentine Stokes, a former World War II fighter pilot who retrained as a doctor and took up employment in Sarawak. He later moved to Borneo and started a flying doctor practice. Dr. Stokes' name will come up again and again, as you can tell later on. The third to arrive was actually Dr. Ernst and Ruth Kranzenstein. For ease, we call him Cranston, Dr. Cranston. They arrived with baby Eva. Baby Eva was actually just a month old when she arrived in Sandakan. The family left for Lahadatu in the southeast of Borneo, and they were also engaged by Valentine Stokes. The third to arrive was actually an obstetrician born in Pigram, Bohemia, Austro-Hungary. It's currently Wrocław in Poland. He became, because of the Anschluss, he became stateless. And from July 1938, he left Vienna for Paris, and 4 months after Anschluss. And in November 1938, he applied for a 3-month visa to study in the Tropical School for Medicine in London. Laban, I think he actually got his contract from Dr. Laban, because Dr. Laban was actually important in his application for North Borneo. So he arrived in the Sandakan in 1939, and he left for Tawau to join, to open a private practice. The last to arrive was Dr. Konrad Blau from Darmstadt, Germany, where he graduated as a doctor of medicine at the University of Breslau. His wife, Isla, was born in Breslau too. They arrived from Singapore, and they were immediately sent to Kudat, and he was stationed at the Kudat General Hospital. At that point, Mrs. Blau was one of the 3 European ladies in Kudat. In September 1939, when the Kudat community finally received the outbreak of war in Europe, they still carried on as life as normal. You know, they held a football match and probably had tea. And in October 1939, the Blaus welcomed a child, the first child in Jesselton, who was christened at the St. Peter's Catholic Church. Konrad Hermann Blau was a Catholic, but he was originally Jewish, as you know. So it was only Link, Sternfeld, and Kranzenstein that were granted employment visas to North Borneo through Dr. Valentine Stokes. Laban and Blau actually were employed directly by the company. So at the start of the war, there was approximately 13 Jews that made North Borneo their home. In the meantime, back in Europe, the events of the war, where Germany invaded Poland and war was declared. It's also worth to mention that the establishment of the Auschwitz complex in 1939, and in October 1941 was the establishment of the extermination and concentration camp at Lublin in Poland. This name I'll reiterate this name later on in the presentation. Back to Southeast Asia. We had the battle for the Pacific. So it's all concurrent, right, with the battle for Europe. With Britain preoccupied, it was only a matter of time before the Japanese launched an attack on Singapore. After sending reinforcements to Europe and Africa in support of Britain, and with the threat of the impending war with Japan, Australia, which was a British colony at the time, started to dispatch troops for the defense of Singapore and Malaya from February 1941 to February 1942. The threat intensified when Japan signed the alliance with Germany and Italy in September 1941. On 7 September 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and staged a declaration of war with the US and the UK. It all started now with the Japanese. They invaded northern Malaya from Thailand, and they bulldozed their way on a bicycle blitzkrieg. Don't ask me why, and successfully invaded the whole of Malaya. That sort of caused the retreat of Allied forces from Malaya to Singapore. The fall of the island was imminent, and it fell under Japanese command in February 1942. This proved a great blow for Britain and Australia, as more than 100,000 Allied troops were taken prisoners, including 15,000 Australian soldiers at Changi prison. This is Changi prison in Singapore. Can you see that? And that's the occupying forces in Singapore. Now, this is a little bit of hinterland for our next input. Sorry. Right. So basically, concurrently, the Japanese took over Borneo basically within 3 weeks, starting from Miri in Sarawak and Western Brunei, and coming down from the southwest coast of North Borneo. By 17 January 1942, they have taken over Sandakan. At that point, we were just sitting ducks. We had no army, we had a volunteer force. So basically, we had no choice but to welcome the Japanese with very little resistance. And what happened next was the prisoners of war. The Australian Imperial Force had conscripted several members of the Jewish community for the defense of Malaya and Singapore that arrived between, they were enlisted in 1941, the ages of 19 to 31. They were reported missing from 15 February 1942 following the surrender of Singapore, and they were initially taken as prisoners of war at Changi prison. On 17 July 1942, the first group of Australian prisoners of war, or B Force, arrived in Sandakan Bay on the Ubi Maru. This include 3 Jewish boys, Simon Harris, Robert Levy, Chaim Stolaski, and Bernard White. After spending a night in the Catholic Church and convent, they were marched to the Sandakan camp. It was a former experimental garden owned by the Forestry Department, 8 of town. They were met by the camp commandant, Lieutenant Susumu Hoshijima, who was said to be very arrogant and resplendent in riding boots and spurs, who announced that the POWs were there to build an aerodrome from the site, which was expected to be completed in 3 years. One of the survivors of the Sandakan camp, one of the 6 survivors of the Sandakan camp, we're talking about 2,500 prisoners of war, only 6 survived. He recalled when he arrived in the Sandakan camp, he said, we had it easy the first 12 months. I reckon a dozen died at the top. Sure, we had work to do on the drone. We used to get flogged, but we had plenty of food and cigarettes. We actually had a canteen, and we were getting paid 10 cents a day. I think a coconut was 1 cent, and the turtle egg was 1 cent, and a fair-sized banana about 1 cent. It was a good camp. It was a good camp to start with. By the following year, they sent another troop of prisoners. They included another 3 Jewish boys, Bernard White, Chaim David Stolaski, and William Sharp. As you can tell, that they were all born in Australia, with the exception of Cyril Harris and Chaim Stolaski. He was basically born in Warsaw, Poland, and sort of went to Australia and enlisted in the war. So that's what we had the camp. Okay. North Borneo suffered greatly under Japanese rule. I won't go into detail now at the moment because I have a lot of ground to cover. The Europeans were imprisoned at the Sandakan and Berhala Island camps, and were later transported by Japanese hell ships to locations such as the Batu Lintang camp in Sandakan. So this is worth noting, Batu Lintang and Berhala Island. The prisoners were ill-treated, tortured, and killed. Malnutrition, starvation, and disease was rife, and so was the marked increase in subversive activities by unconfined persons. from October to 1944 to July 1945, the Allied forces embarked on a series of bombing raids on main towns such as Sandakan, Jesselton, Tawau, and Kudat. Sandakan, as you can see here, this photograph is quite eerie because it's actually taken while they were bombing Sandakan. I think Grandpa lived here, sadly. So basically, this was the bombing of Sandakan. And they basically bombed the aerodrome or the airstrip that the POWs were building. So it also rendered them redundant. By the 6 and 7 air raids and the attack of petrol torpedo boats in Sandakan on the 26th and the 27th of May, it had fatal implications for the town's civilian leaders who were rounded up by the suspicious Japanese military and beheaded in the infamous Sandakan Day massacre. And this event, I would reintroduce this event a little bit later. The Allies also indiscriminately targeted Japanese held ships that were used to transport cargo, labor, Japanese troops and employees all over their empire in Southeast Asia. By the end of the war, there were 134 held ships. And for the record, the Comte Verde, the ship that rescued European refugees, was actually renamed the Teikyo Maru. It was taken over by the Japanese and used as a held ship. So some of the ships that rescued Jews were used as held ships. So in the meantime, we've got a series of bombing raids. This is Sandakan after the bombing raid, but you cannot blame the Allies entirely because soon after the 6 or 7 bombing raid, the Japanese actually set fire to most homes, the whole town. So we were reduced to rubble and burnt out carcasses of former buildings. And this is Jesselton after the bomb raids. This clock tower still stands at the moment. It is worth a mention, although, it's worth to mention the American airmen. As you know, the Allies we had American allies. During the height of the Allied bombing, gunner John H. Grossman and the crew of 9 took off on a Catalina on a plane on a reconnaissance mission from Palawan Island, the Philippines, because Philippines had an American base. So that's where they staged a lot of the bombing campaigns. They also staged bombing campaigns for islands like Morotai in Netherlands, Indies. But this event is actually worth a mention because it has a very beautiful story at the end of it. We have actually, I found out there were 2 Jews on this aircraft, namely Grossman, John Grossman and David Sagarin. But I'll focus on John Grossman for this one. He joined the US Army in earlier on, and he was stationed in Philippines, which was under colonial rule. In 1945, on board the plane, he was shot down and killing a crew of, I think about 8 of them died, 6 of them died, over a town called Kuala Penyu in the southwest of North Borneo. I can go back to the map if you're not sure. Both Sagarin and Grossman were listed as missing in action. But in 1948, his father, Mr. Grossman, we only know him as Mr. Grossman, visited North Borneo. He went to Labuan and he met Robert Knowles, the chief customs officer there. He wanted closure for him and his wife because John Grossman, sadly, was their only son. He could hardly get any information, but as you know, information about the crash at that point was highly classified. So he actually physically came to North Borneo to look for the aircraft, the site where his son died. He actually enlisted Muhammad Yassin, a local leader, for help. But the next day, he returned with an aluminium door from the aircraft, from the jungle. Now, this is the bit of the aircraft that was that crashed in Kuala Penyu. In truth, Muhammad Yassin, the aide, did not know exactly what happened, but in order to spare Mr. Crossman the gruesome truth, told him that the locals had buried the bodies in the jungle at an unknown location. But in fact, both Sagarin and Grossman were not found at all. They were just completely missing. However, his body was obviously never recovered. They did recover Sagarin's body that was repatriated to New York. But what Mr. Grossman did was he returned some years later And he also realized that he noticed that it was a very poor community village, and that he would build a school in memory of his son, John Grossman. And it's called the Grossman Memorial School. And here's the school in the 1950s with Muslim children, as you can tell by the hats. The building is now disused. It's still standing, but it's disused, and it stands as a tangible reminder of the far-sightedness, kindness, and generosity of the Grossman family. Many in Sabah at the moment are the alumni from this amazing school, and most of them are Muslims. So we have a school that's set up by a Jewish family from Illinois. Sadly, I do not have photographs, and these are the only photographs of the Grossmans that I could actually have. And this was the inside of the school with an American flag. And these are the pictures of the Grossman family. That happened in the American airman that dropped from the sky. Sadly, this is one of another very tragic, incredibly tragic stories. The third air raid that occurred in December 1944 obliterated the Sandakan airstrip. The airstrips contributed to the Japanese decision to move remaining passengers further inland, 260 kilometers inland, to a town called Ranau. So a little bit, so this is Kudat, that's the famous Jesselton. So basically they had to walk, right? In the meantime, the state of the Sandakan camp became increasingly fraught. The POWs were in a perilous state of health, suffering from malnutrition and starvation. Diseases like malaria, beriberi, dysentery was rife. One of the Australian Jews, Bernard White, died at this camp in 1944. Anyway, the first death marches occurred in January to March 1945, with 455 POWs to serve as porters. As you can imagine, many died during the marches through low-lying swamps and jungle, and they were basically finished off. This is reminiscent to the death marches in Europe. It's quite sad that Chaim Skolarsky would escape possibly a death march in Europe, only to die on another death march in Borneo, of all places. The second death march took place in May 1945 with a further 530 prisoners. Simon Ewell Harris and Robert Edwin Levy fell during the second death march. In the meantime, the killing continued at the Sandakan camp, with the last prisoner beheaded just hours before the Japanese surrender on the 15th of August. The last group of prisoners of war at the Ranau, so I think at that point, I don't know how many we have left, were killed actually on the 27th of August after the Japanese surrender. So basically killing was rife. The only people that survived the whole death march were the people who escaped along during the death marches, or the ones who were escaped when they were in camp. Basically, to summarize, in January 1945, there were 2,428 Allied servicemen at the Sandakan camp, 1,787 Australians and 641 British. Only 6 survived, all Australians. There's another bit of research that I need to touch here, because I can believe there could be other Jewish conscripts who were from Britain. So these Britons, so out of luck, I actually found them. They're actually buried in North Borneo. They were basically buried in an original, I think they were moved twice. This was the original Sandakan camp. This is the original Sandakan cemetery. And they were moved to Labuan. They were moved to Labuan because this site was prone to flooding. And the graves were moved to Labuan in the Labuan War Cemetery in 1949. This is actually next to our airport, our current airstrip. So the airstrip that they built, we actually used as an airstrip, as the airport. So that's for the prisoners of war. And you may ask what happens to the others, particularly Mrs. Cohen. Mr. and Mrs. Cohen remained in Sandakan when the Japanese landed in January 1942. Initially, the Jews of North Borneo were not interned, and they were free to do as they please. It was recorded that in the fall of 1942, Moselle Cohen was hospitalized for a skin disorder, where she met the writer Agnes Keith and her son George. Agnes Keith and George were actually interned at the Berhala Island camp, and they were in the hospital because they had malaria. Menachem Cohen, this is the only description I have of Menachem Cohen, described by Agnes Keith as a sickly man older than Moselle, who came begging her to come back to the shop, because Mrs. Moselle Cohen was also in hospital, to deal with the Japanese soldiers who demanded goods for half price. And when he refused, they would steal the stuff and beat him up. However, the amazing Mrs. Cohen had her own methods when dealing with the Japanese, combining cunning, collaboration, coercion, bribery, and betrayal, and in the process, managed to befriend them, to help her smuggle food and medicines to the European prisoners at Berhala camp. And smuggle she did, working with other unconfined Europeans, even helping prisoners escape. Only to get caught in July 1943 and imprisoned at the Sanakan civil prison, and subsequently in October was transferred to Kuching on a Japanese hell ship with the others. Basically, she also was transported there with the other doctors, Fritz Laban and Dr. Sternfeld, and some wayward Australian officers at the Sanakan camp. In 1944, the group was court-martialed and given sentences. Mrs. Cohen was fined and released, and I got this report from the War Archives in Australia, but was later taken back into custody and executed. But there were differing accounts by my mother, by Yahya Cohen in the Australian War Report. They were thought to have died in an Australian Japanese hell ship that was bombed by the Allies. She was thought to have been tortured quite badly, according to my mother. According to Agnes Keith, Menachem Cohen actually, I think, passed away earlier on. So he was basically spared the trauma of, going to be tortured and to be at prison. But back in Singapore, Yahya Cohen, as you can tell here, he was in prison at Changi, where they even had a kosher kitchen, apparently. Together with other Singapore Sephardi Jews, he survived the war and became an eminent surgeon. In fact, he was also in prison with Fred Isaacs, who's the father of my Jewish relative in Singapore. They were, I think, the first two. They were prominent Jews in Singapore, and they were both targeted first. I think Isaacs was, this is a bit of new information, by the way, I got it on Sunday. Isaacs was first to be arrested. He was an optician, and then Yahya Cohen was second on the list. But however, thankfully, they survived the war, and Yahya Cohen became basically an eminent surgeon of mythical status. And Yahya Cohen later married Janina Sophie Horowitz, an Israeli water engineer in 1965, passing away in Singapore in 2003. They have no children. So you have pictures of Yahya here, Yahya Cohen later in years. But I think I'm the only owner of a pre-photo of Yahya Cohen. And this is Changi Prison from a bird's eye view of Changi Prison. Now, Kita Arn Link. Now, this is the most tragic story so far. Before fleeing North Borneo, Kita took refuge with her mother, Rosalie, a widow, and her sister Herta at 177 Kufustendam, Berlin, as pictured here. They were all members of the Berlin resistance. Aided by the protector Els Blockwich, both Kita and Herta had tried to escape abroad. Only Kita was successful. Herta, her sister, was forced into labor at Siemens in Spandau, Berlin, and subsequently Herta and Rosalie were deported to the Minsk ghetto on the 14th of November, 1941. Rosalie did not survive the ghetto and was thought to have been murdered. Herta was once again forced into labor and was later sent to the gas chambers, the 10th of October, 1943, at the Majdanek extermination camp in Poland. So little did I know we had a connection to Majdanek. This is kind of unusual. The Arnlings did not fare better in Borneo. Neighbors to my grandpa Pongholo, Willem Link died prematurely from a tropical disease. This is according to my mother, because they were neighbors. The increasing intensity of Allied bombing. So back to this story that I sort of mentioned earlier, the increased intensity of the Allied bombings and the PT boat attacks on Sanakan in May 1945 led the Japanese to arrest a group of civilians, including Chinese businessmen, the Kwans of Man Wulung, and others such as my grandfather Pong Holo and Kita Link. They were massacred on the 27th of May, which is now a very famous Sanakan Day massacre, and they were buried in a mass grave. As you can tell, this is the memorial stone. This is after the bodies have been exhumed, and there she is near my grandfather in the same mass grave as my grandfather, who's Pongholo Dominic, and you have Mrs. Link. This was by luck that I found out that she was Jewish. I didn't realize, but I brought my mom to the massacre, the memorial, because of her father was here, and she did mention that Mrs. Link was Jewish. That's what sort of piqued my interest. Local reports on the massacre were recorded by writer Agnes Keith, who herself was incarcerated and suffered at the hands of the Japanese. In her book, Three Came Home, Kita Arn Link was described by Agnes Keith as a flaxen-haired, nerve-worn, undernourished, refugee German Jewess. Eyewitnesses told Agnes Keith that Mrs. Link was very brave. She did not weep. She only prayed until they killed her. I doubt if she ever found out what happened to her mother and her sister back in Europe. So the names were basically commemorated at the Sanakan Memorial, which was a very sad story. The next person I'd like to address is Dr. Ernst Sternfeld. Unfortunately, I don't have photographs of them. So during the war, Ernst worked as a company doctor in the North Borneo Trading Company. The company was largely involved in the extraction and export of timber. He was, in 1942, he was interned at the Berhala Island camp. Probably due to his association with his former employer, Dr. Valentine Stux, because I think Dr. Valentine Stux was also engaged in quite a lot of subversive activity. So anybody that was sort of associated with him was sort of guilty. Agnes Keith wrote glowingly of Dr. Sternfeld, and he treated herself and her son, George, for malaria. She said Dr. Sternfeld was an elderly Austrian refugee Jew said to have been a famous obstetrician, with gentle and elegant foreign ways, which prepared us to believe in anything. He was accepted in Sanakan and treated without prejudice, but not taken to people's hearts. We who meet him in the future, we who for 3.5 years knew his work in captivity, will, I hope, give him the warmth we did not give him before. The Berhala internees were transferred to the Batu Lintang camp in Kuching. He continued to treat inmates in the Batu Lintang camp. After the liberation of Batu Lintang, he applied for North Borneo passport, North Borneo naturalization in June 1949. At that point, he sort of went missing, but he probably was in Borneo quietly doing his work. But at some point, he returned to Austria, where he died in 1968, and I found him buried in the Central Cemetery in Vienna. This photograph is actually of Dr. Stux. Now, this is Dr. Stux and his flying aircraft in 1935, and this was set in Sanakan Bay. And interestingly, you could see a Chinese junk in the background. That was what we were like. The next to follow is Dr. Fritz Laban. When the war started in Europe, the British North Borneo Company terminated Dr. Laban's contract. Being German, he was suspected of Nazi sympathies. He was ordered back to Jesselton, where his movements were restricted. And I said earlier, someone did not get the memo. Before the outbreak of the Pacific War, Dr. Laban secured a contract with Singapore oil fields based in Miri, Sarawak, and moved back to Sanakan, where he opened a dental practice in 1940. Unhappy with his position, Dr. Laban actually returned to Britain in March 1940 after the start of the war to submit another application to the General Medical Council, and he was rejected for the 3rd time. So hence in June, he was back in Sanakan. Basically, he missed the Battle of Britain by a month. He reopened his dental practice, and at that point was living with Dr. Sternfeld. in early 1941, realizing that the war with Japan was inevitable, Dr. Laban sent his wife to the US for safety, where Mrs. Laban had successfully applied for naturalization. So when the Japanese landed in 1941, Dr. Laban was still running his own practice, and he came in Sandakan. In 1942, he came under the employ of the Japanese to treat their troops at the Sandakan Civil Hospital. He also treated many civilian internees at the Bahala Island camp. However, his visits to the Bahala Island camp became reconnaissance trips. And from June 1942 and March 1943, he and others, Dr. Taylor, the medical officer at the hospital, Dr. Hewans, and of course, our very famous Moselle Cohn, became part of an underground movement. Agnes Keith wrote of Dr. Laban during her treatment for malaria. He said, during this period in hospital, I talked a great deal with Dr. Laban, a refugee German Jew, dentist by profession, who have been employed by our government when the Japanese came in and was now trying to work under them in the hospital. He did his best to discourage me from false optimism, telling me that peace could not come in less than a year at least. A year to me is an unendurable length of time. He said his past experience of war had learned that it is false to believe that because conditions were unendurable, one cannot endure them. Dr. Laban was an angel to George and me, bringing extra food, extra clothes, getting me a thermos, doing anything he could think of. I was nervous for his sake, as he had something still to lose. I had not, but he would not be warned. He said, if they imprison me, I do not mind. Until then, I will help you all. And he did so fearlessly until finally, with other doctors, he was accused of conspiracy and sentenced to jail. Now, as a group of, basically in July 1943, they were all caught, including other locals, arrested for smuggling food and medicines to the Berhala internees, radio parts to the Sandakan camp, and helping Australian prisoners of war escape by arranging boats to the Philippines via the Tawi-Tawi Islands. In October 1943, they were transported to Kuching on a hell ship. Under the Kampatai, Dr. Laban would endure torture and beatings, which would become a daily routine. Food was rationed and conditions were unsanitary. Infection and disease was rife. Batu Lintang was finally liberated in 11 September 1945, and in October, Dr. Laban issued a statement to the Australian Imperial Force. He did not apply for naturalization like the others, but joined his wife in the US as she was issued with a US visa in September 1946. He arrived at Ellis Island. So this is the Sandakan Civil Hospital where Dr. Laban worked, which is up the road from Grandpa's house. And this is the Batu Lintang camp when it was liberated by the Australians. So this is it. So the next lot were Dr. Earth and Ruth Cranston. They had a private practice in Tawau, a town southeast of Sabah. They were considered unconfined internees because they actually needed the expertise, you know, because they were doctors and they were really important. He was transferred to a hemp plantation, a Japanese hemp plantation, as medical officer. It was reported that they were treated like dogs by the Japanese. In 1943, the second child, Michael Cranston, was born under Japanese occupation in the state. So in these photographs, this is Michael when after the war, when he left for Australia. This is Eva Miriam right at this moment. Was her visiting her grandfather's birthplace in Hamelin in Germany. In 1945, Ruth and the children left for Australia to start the application for naturalization, while Dr. Cranston applied for and received his naturalization certificate for North Borneo. His wife and the children were back in Australia. He worked as medical officer at after the war at the Sagama Tobacco Estate. As far as we know, that the family settled in Australia permanently. Eva Miriam pictured here was an infant, a month old when she arrived in North Borneo, and she married Harold Brown, a Polish Jew in Australia, and had a son, David, in 1965. David and Harold visited Hamelin in Germany in 2006 to set up a gravestone for Sigmund Krankenstein, Eva's grandfather. And in 2009, she and her husband returned to Hamelin to visit the Jewish community. The last on the list was, this is a bit of a James Bond story, this one here, Dr. Blau. At the start of the war, Dr. Blau and family, newly born son, they were rounded up by, all the Europeans were rounded up, and he was sent basically to a Japanese hemp plantation. At that point, the Blaus were listed as Catholics and were not treated any differently as a German of Jewish origin. He was singled out to work with Dr. Taylor, same name coming up, at the Sandakan Civil Hospital, and was subsequently transferred to the Mostin Manila Hemp Estate in 1942 as an internee without confinement. The estate, the Mostin Estate here, I think, okay, let me go back a bit. Now, this is the hemp factory in Tawau. This background is basically the hemp plantation. Hemp, as you know, is probably it is a species of the banana plant. So this is what they were doing at the point. The Mostin Estate, was called then, was previously owned by British Abaka Limited and was known as BAL, and was taken over by a Japanese concern, Nissan Norin. It had a population of 750, 250 armed civilians, 500 Japanese civilians, and 5 Kampetai. As you know, the Kampetai is the equivalent of the Gestapo. On that note, it's worth to mention that we had Japanese migration from the 1880s, right before the war. They were workers, they were private investors. So we had a number of Japanese civilian population who were rounded up by the Allies, and they were sent to camps in Australia. Dr. Blau became an important collaborator and informant for the Allies while on duty at the estate, risking the lives of himself and his burgeoning family. He was aptly listed as secret agent on the local heroes roll. In 1943, under confinement, Japanese confinement, there appeared another baby Blau, a daughter that was born on the plantation, followed by another son in July 1945. So the children, there were 3 Jewish children that were born under confinement, Japanese confinement. Now, because Dr. Blau was a very important person for the Allies, in 17 July 1945, headed by Major Blow under Operation Agas 4, the Australian Allies started to hatch an escape plans for the Blaus and assembled a rescue team of 3 guerrillas, 2 guides, and 3 boatmen, led by Sergeant Coram. Now, he led the rescue of the Blaus. They left the coastal town of Semporna through San Segal and the Langas River and overland to the Blaus house. So basically, they landed at the Langas River here. This was the hospital where Dr. Blau worked, and I believe he could have been in one of these quarters that they sort of came and extracted him and his whole family through the plantation, through a little boat, right? So under the darkness on the 2nd of August, now we're talking about 2 weeks before Japanese surrender, the escape party, including the Blaus, babies, and several Chinese coolies, trekked across overland past the Japanese headquarters to the waiting boats headed for Semporna. The Blaus were evacuated from Semporna to Jesselton on a Catalina flying boat. In 1950, the Blaus became citizens of North Borneo. Mrs. Blau and the children, then aged 14, 7, and 5, must have returned to Britain as she was listed in the electoral register from 1957 to 1964. I thought that Dr. Blau followed. He probably traveled back to Britain in 1958. However, he was reported to be in North Borneo, still living in both Borneo on the 19th of February 1960. When as commissioner for the St. John Ambulance Brigade, he became in charge of Lady Mountbatten's tour of the brigade. Lady Mountbatten at that point was superintendent of the St. John's Brigade. She actually died in her sleep at Jesselton 2 days later on the 21st of February. Local sources actually stated that Dr. Blau set up a local practice, because at the moment there are many in Sabah would recall the name Dr. Blau. I think, and they also know a little bit of gossip about Dr. Blau, which I'm not going to get into, which is not fair. But he was well loved. He probably came back to Borneo because he had many friends there. And he felt safe there, I guess. And so this brings us to just about the end of the war. And just to round up, as you all know, Germany surrenders, and followed by the Nuremberg trials. Japan surrendered on the 15th of August, 1945. And it was basically, the formal surrender was signed on board the battleship, the SS Missouri at Tokyo Bay. The US General Douglas MacArthur, the Supreme Commander of the Allied forces, led the signing of the surrender with 9 Allied nations. That includes US, China, UK, USSR, Australia, Canada, France, New Zealand, and the Netherlands. From 1945 to 1951, the Australian war crimes trials were held in 6 countries, including North Borneo, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, Australia, Singapore, and Hong Kong. In January 1946, the Sanakan Camp Commandant, the Susumi Hoshijima, otherwise known as the Beast of Belsen. So I realized that they would have liberated Belsen by then, or the Beast of Borneo in this case, was tried in Labuan and subsequently executed at Rabaul, Papua New Guinea on the 6th of April, 1946. So now this is the last slide, just to round up. Finally, on 15th of July 1946, North Borneo became a British colony. As you know, it was run by the Chartered Company, and because they were profit-making, they basically went bankrupt, completely bankrupt. It's not that Britain could afford to have another colony, but we became a colony. Sandakan ceased to be capital, and Jesselton was established in its place. In September 1963, after contentious deliberation in the form of the Malaysia Agreement 1953, the newly formed colony, together with Sarawak and the other Borneo state, the Federation of Malaysia and Singapore formed the Federation of Malaysia. The state was subsequently called Sabah, so now it's part of Malaysian Borneo. In 1965, Singapore left the Federation of Malaysia. And in 1967, Jesselton was renamed Kota Kinabalu. So just in case you're looking for flights, we are Kota Kinabalu now. Kota means fort in the local language, and Kinabalu is the highest peak in Southeast Asia that forms a magnificent backdrop to Jesselton. And on the last note, on 15th of July 2011, Uncle Modi, David Mordecai, the last resident Malayan-born Jew, died in Penang. He was the general manager of the Eastern and Oriental Hotel in Georgetown and was buried at the Japanese cemetery there. He was our last Jew that survived throughout. And there you go. This comes to the end of my talk, and several people I like to thank, including my relatives, and of course, Lawrence Joffe, Uri Aranyas, Nicholas Jacobs. And thank you so much for your time. This is my contact, just in case anyone's interested. Thank you. I got to put on the.
Yeah. Don't go away. Rosalie Lala, thank you so much. That was an amazing tour de force. Can you hear me? You're muted.
I haven't muted her. No, she's not muted.
No, say something.
We can't hear you, Rosalie.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now
Yeah.
we can. Okay, no, that was an amazing tour de force, and it must have demanded so much time and effort to find the information in the archives. And you mentioned you traveled to Australia.
No, actually, it was all online. They've digitized.
Oh, it was all online.
Yeah.
Oh, amazing.
It's an amazing, but I could still travel to Australia. So
a last request from a couple of people on the chat. Can they have your phone number?
yes.
Can you just write it in the chat?
Okay, it's on the screen actually, but I'll write it in the chat.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
074921. Yeah, I'm actually going back to North Borneo, Malaysian Borneo, next week. So this is my UK number, but you can get me on WhatsApp. And my email, I think might as well give you my email.
Thank you. Yeah, my regret is that nobody from Australia was able to join us, because I know there was some interest in your talk, but it's 4:30 in the morning,
yes,
Australian time, so they're all going to have to watch the video.
Yeah, carry on, put his hand up.
Yeah, so we've got a few questions in the chat. Let me see. Start with Lawrence Joffrey wondered about family connections. Of course, to Yahya Cohen. He says, were there other links between Singapore and North Borneo Jews, especially during the high holidays? Was there imported kosher food or matzah? And were North Borneo Jews buried in special sections within Christian or Muslim cemeteries?
Well, I'm not sure about the kosher food from Singapore, but I was aware that Mrs. Cohen used to make rice cakes for Mrs. Cohen. And then I told Lawrence, he said, they're Sephardi Jews, definitely. The cuisine that came up. And what was the second question?
About the family connections between Yahya Cohen and Singapore.
Yahya Cohen, you mean you mean the family connections with us, with my family?
Yes, I think so. Yes. Do you have any family connections, or is it just?
Yeah, it's incredibly personal.
Oh,
I can say, because he was actually a boyfriend of my Auntie Flora. And that's how I found out.
Yeah, I know you started
and
with that.
there was
a love interest, you said.
And there's one love interest, and it carried on after the war.
Yes, that's amazing, isn't it?
But then according to Auntie Flo, that they could never get it together because we're Catholic, and I don't know, but this is I have to recheck. But apparently Betty Cohen, his sister, was sent to Catholic school and apparently converted.
Okay,
Catholic, and it broke their hearts.
Okay.
And he couldn't go through that with Auntie Flo.
Yes, yeah. And I know you said you didn't want to go into it, but would you say Dr. Blau had a mistress or a girlfriend in North Borneo that kept him from joining his family in England?
Yeah, I think so. I checked. There were no children.
Okay, that much we know.
Just in case we got baby Blaus, I mean, but I think that's what happened.
Yes.
He had a love interest, and maybe that's why he never went back to England. He probably did, I don't know. No. But I know he traveled back in 1958. I traced this, but he probably came back to North Borneo, obviously.
Yes.
Many people remember him. He's kind of quite a well-known doctor, actually. Pretty well-known doctor.
Amazing.
I think it's waiting very patiently.
Yes, thank you very much for waiting very patiently, Yitzhak. Off you go.
Rosalie, it was very impressive. I'm a historian on Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews in the Holocaust. You talked about the refugees, but you didn't talk about what happened to the other local Jews. Maybe 20 Jews. Correct me if I'm wrong. What happened to them? Wait. First of all,
sorry.
Were they sent to Singapore? In the answer, tell me. But before, tomorrow, I'm supposed to give a presentation at Bar Ilan on the Holocaust in the Far East. So if you want to give me a few slides, I'd appreciate it. I'll send you my email, especially about Mrs. Cohen, the dissident. I forgot her first name. All right, but yeah. So now answer the question, please.
Which is,
who were the local Jews? What happened to the local Jews in the Holocaust? Were they sent to Singapore, or what was their fate? Because you only talked about the refugees.
You mean which local Jews? Mrs. Cohen and the
all the others. They were dispersed in a few towns. You talked about how
you mean the political refugees?
Yeah. But in other words, the local Jews obviously became political refugees. No,
yes.
Not the immigrants. The local Jews who were either Iraqi or or Dutch, what happened to them during the Holocaust? Because there's also a switch. In 1943, for example, in Indonesia, they started cracking down on the Jews as Jews. I'm talking about the Japanese. The Japanese usually arrested Jews as nationals of the United States or Britain. But here, what, in a nutshell, tell us what happened to the actual Jews who were the veteran Jews on the island. What happened to them under the Japanese?
The veteran Jews, meaning the planters. The planters.
Yeah.
Anyone the planters. The planters actually. They left. They were tobacco planters, and I think when the tobacco industry sort of became superseded by the rubber industry, basically they left. We didn't have they could be there. I mean, still open to research. Like I said, this is a very robust skeleton, and of course there are holes of research that I really should concentrate on. The least research part are the planters, because I have many names, but I don't know which ones are Jewish. You see, because they were Dutch and German names. Yeah.
But in general, beyond the Cohens, what all these people left, the Benjamins and et cetera, would they didn't stay?
As I stated earlier on, Benjamin Cohen de Lissa actually left for Australia in the, let's see, he left for Australia in 1892. Right? And then Tuan Brasim Abrahamson actually left in 1891. And he basically came to Borneo, Brunei, so I don't know how much he was doing there, but he actually returned to Britain and he died in Bournemouth in 1915. He didn't stay. The Messiahs, as I explained earlier, is they actually went back to Singapore in the mid-1930s after settling in Sandakan. Mrs. Cohen and Mr. Cohen, Menachem Cohen, actually stayed on during the war. And of course, we have the doctors, the Jewish doctors that didn't have any choice.
No,
they just had to be there.
We have Alan Fahy on the call. I hope he's still there. Alan says he recognizes quite a few surnames from Singapore. So he might be able to help you identify the Jews on your lists.
Shall I get Alan?
Just an idea.
Alan, do you want to speak and start your video, please?
I think my video is on, no?
Now it's on. It was showing.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, no, I know many of these names. I mean, I did not know Yahya Cohen in Singapore, but I heard a lot about him from the people who lived there.
Yes.
I do know the Benjamin because the son of that Benjamin, Frank,
right.
And his brothers are all on the website. You can track their genealogy on farhi.org. The same thing for the Sassoon. I mean, the Sassoon, they were more recent time, they were out of Jakarta. But it's the same Sassoon that I think they were in Borneo earlier. The Sassoon of Jakarta were mainly in the watch business and ended up doing entertainment, and they owned the famous coffee bean chain of coffees.
Oh, goodness.
Yes.
Okay.
Because they all intermarried with the local families. I could not find, I have a lot of Moselle Cohen, but I couldn't find any to the name that you mentioned. I don't have Yahya Cohen, but I do know a person who's physically in Boca, Rebecca Roth, OTT, who probably can tell you the history of everybody there because she was very close working with the Jewish Welfare Board and running the nursing home for the old. So we can correspond outside talk, and I'll get you in touch with her so you can maybe get more information, and maybe we can add to the website, to my website, the Jews of Borneo that are linked to.
Yay! Good one. Thank you.
Alan's website is farhi.org.
Farhi.org. Okay.
And I can put you in touch if need be. Okay.
I took a screenshot of her,
Yeah.
of her details.
Oh, excellent. You're well organized, Anna. So Avi Kumar asks the leading question, which I think you had when you gave your talk to the Sabah Society about anti-Semitism.
Yes.
And why are Malaysians more anti-Semitic these days than they were before? He says it's very sad.
It is very sad, and it didn't help that our former prime minister was anti-Semitic, Dr. Mahathir, and he's quite vocal about it. And to be honest, I think it's out of ignorance as well, because I don't think any of them has met a Jew in their lives. You know, and I think it's out of total ignorance. So apparently when I gave this talk to Sabah Society, everyone was saying that it's talks like this would re-educate people, especially the Jews of Malaysia, if they care to sit and listen. I mean, it's a long talk. I'm so sorry. But
No, it was fascinating, absolutely fascinating, and very important, I think, because there are black holes in our knowledge. You know, we certainly don't know a lot about how the war affected, you know, communities in the Far East. And it is a revelation, I think. Well, it is a revelation to me, you know, exactly what happened. I think certainly the lady who spoke about the Jews of Indonesia, she managed to dig up some harrowing stories about how they were treated during the war.
right.
As Yitzhak mentioned, they were actually interned for being Jews, not for being British or Dutch.
Right.
So that was, but that was a much larger community. There were about 600 Jews on Surabaya.
Somehow the memo never got to Borneo. So they were accepted.
Yes.
Totally. We never got the memo, basically. Exactly. So therefore, everybody was happy.
Yeah,
Happy. Thankfully.
That's wonderful. I'm just going to check if there are any more questions. Avi Kumar wants to know if any Sri Lankan Jews got to Malaysia, Singapore. I'm not sure which Sri Lankan Jews you mean or you have in mind, Avi, because I don't think there were very many in Sri Lanka. I may be wrong. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah. Can you unmute him a minute? Sorry. So Avi Kumar. Yeah. Okay. Hello. You're unmuted.
I mean, there weren't many Jews in Sri Lanka to begin with, but I can't remember the exact year, but somebody wrote that after independence, many Sri Lankan Jews moved to Malaysia and Singapore, and nobody in Singapore and Malaysia has been able to confirm this, but it's information which has been recycled and recycled in every time somebody writes an article about Sri Lankan Jews. And with my own research and even asking people in Singapore and Malaysia, nobody says that they've come across a Sri Lankan Jew in Malaysia or Singapore. And I just wanted to know if anybody can confirm this rumor.
I think you need to ask Professor Karim, Yitzhak Karim. He's just written in the chat, Jews in Sri Lanka were descendants of Portuguese Jews. So they obviously go back to the Portuguese Inquisition. There were refugees from there.
The thing is, like, even though many Portuguese Jews came to Sri Lanka, they were actually the conversos. So they actually came and they converted. So Sri Lanka actually has the highest number of Sephardic last names per capita outside of Israel.
Wow.
But and the thing is, but most of them will be Catholic. So if somebody has a very Sephardic name, they're Catholic. And anyway, coming back to the point, the most recent Jewish community in Sri Lanka were the British Jewish servicemen. And many of them ended up marrying local women, and so it's mostly they were the most recent community, and maybe some Indian Jews.
Yeah, because I think, you know, the Portuguese Portuguese, the Jews from Portuguese descent Jews, Sephardi Jews, I believe they would have Portuguese names, right? Latin names. And
they would, but after a few
yes.
generations, what happened was they ended up assimilating. So
yes,
you do
assimilating. Yes. So we have a lot of people of Latin and sort of Spanish and Portuguese names in Malaysia. If they had come to Malaysia, the chances are they would have either gone to Penang, Malacca, or Singapore.
Right.
So Singapore would be, I think, a very safe bet to start your research if you have to, because they do have a Eurasian association. I call it Eurasian, because quite a lot of people from India, when they turn up, because from Portuguese controlled India, when they turn up, they sort of tell everybody, because they've got European sounding names, they sort of declare themselves as Eurasians. So you have D'Souza, Pereira, Lopez, right? So I'm actually related to some of them, the Pereiras. So I guess some of them could have Jewish descendants. So I think Singapore would be a good place to start, and they have really good, basically a network of.
I mean, it's the thing is, like, just because they have the name Pereira or Fernando, that doesn't necessarily, like, sometimes it could mean, but also what happened was during the British time, they would give favors to people who were Christians. So people would convert and they would just copy one of their Christian friends' last names. So they would just, so the name Pereira would just become recycled. Right. Yeah. So just because they have the last name, it can mean, but it doesn't always, because people just used to copy.
Yeah, because my uncle, Alfred Pereira, was actually from Goa. And everybody thought he's half Portuguese because he's got a Portuguese name, but he's actually Indian.
Confuse the issue.
But then when you go to Singapore, they were considered Eurasians because of the name. So my cousin and I actually went to Singapore to look for some Eurasians. So I bet you they probably were descended from a converso along the line. Now they're Catholic.
No, but even today, when people convert to Christianity from Buddhism or Hinduism, the priest will say, they'll tell the priest will say, you have to change your name, and they'll say, what do I change it to? And the priest says, okay, go to the cemetery and pick a random name, and and it would most likely be Pereira or Fernando. So that keeps happening.
That's hilarious. It's funny.
I think we need to talk on the Jews of Singapore. It's obvious.
We need one of the Jews of Sri Lanka
and
as
the
well.
Jews of Sri Lanka.
Now, I found on my bookshelf, we've got a book, The Jews of Singapore, 1830 to 1945, which I'm sure has got a lot of stuff which would be of interest. I bought this in Singapore probably 30 years ago. Certainly, if Lala in London wants to borrow it when she's in London, she's very welcome to.
You're probably thinking, oh no,
it's a
more
personal
Jews.
account by SNA, but it seems to list all the families at the back.
You're probably fed up with Jews now.
Who am I? Anyway, just get in touch with me, because who am I speaking to? You see, this
is Lawrence. Lawrence, yes.
Oh, with Lawrence. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, didn't have his name. So anyway, I think we've come to the end of the questions. Please do read the comments by Professor Kerim in the chat about surnames, or he's speculating as to where they might have come from. I'll let you know the book. Yeah, he's just going to put it in the chat, the book and biographical details.
Oh.
And while he's doing that, I think we've come to the end of the questions. So
actually, I left out something from Lawrence. Just reading. Were Jews buried in special sections within a Christian?
Yes.
Actually, I don't know. It could be, because we've got a Christian cemetery, and I think they would be buried in the Christian cemetery.
Yes.
And there were no special sections.
If there were so few of them,
they were just.
Yes.
So I go to the cemetery to look for names as well, for Jewish names.
Oh my goodness.
I put the details of the book, including the ISBN, in there.
Okay.
I probably bought it in 1986, so I don't know.
I think there are several books on that subject. Anyway, so if there aren't any more questions, I think we will draw this meeting to a close.
Right.
I just want to thank you so much, Rosalie, Lala. That was absolutely fascinating, and I do admire your dedication, perseverance.
Yes.
To actually trace
Stamina.
and your stamina.
And I just happened
Absolutely.
to open the book at a random page,
Oh.
and I see the name Yahya Cohen in 1971, lived in Singapore.
Right.
How
That's
interesting.
just random.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah.
That is amazing. I think everyone will want that book now. Okay, well, thank you very much indeed again, Lala. Thank you all for joining us. We're going to take a break over the Passover holiday. So our next talk will actually be on the 3rd of May, when we have a talk on Judeo-Arabic and how similar or different is it from Arabic. So I look forward to seeing you all then on the 3rd of May. And until then, have a wonderful Passover, Hag Pesach Sameach, and keep safe, keep well, and thank you very much.
Right, you've got the adverts for the next, you've got Judeo-Arabic one, and the other two you've got coming up also on the adverts.
Okay. So, Lawrence, do you want to unmute everyone?
Yeah, well, I stopped the recording. Hold on. Stop share to do that.
So lots of people